Hello, my name is Simon Day, co-author of The TV Delusion, a new book about psychology, belief, religion, and the relationship of these to the TV. Our motivation for writing the book was our realisation that there were many barriers which present themselves to most of us when we try and understand the world around us. Some of these barriers stem from our psychology, while some of them come from more simple sources, such as the language we use. To illustrate this, we've got a short clip taken from a presentation we recently did in Copenhagen. Our friends at the Open Mind Conference were kind enough to allow us to speak, and this was all recorded by our friends over at Gaia TV.
But what do we mean when we say something is true? What does the word true mean? If we have two people and they say that something's true, how do we know it means the same thing? Okay. So we started researching this, and it turns out there are many definitions of the word true. Now, many of them are quite philosophical in nature and probably outside the scope of what we've got to say here. But we felt that there were two different ones which were very, very common. And these are the two we focused on. So what is the truth then? So I'm going to go through two of the definitions, as I said, and the first one I'm going to cover is the one which most people would give if they were asked for a definition of truth. But as we'll see in a minute, weirdly, it's the one which is least often used in practice. Okay, so the first one is called correspondence, and the correspondence theory of truth says that something is true if it corresponds to an event in the real world or a state of the real world. For instance, a simple example, if I say the sentence, "it is raining," then that is true if it's actually raining and false otherwise. Okay, so how does this work in more detail then? How can we break this down into steps? I guess this is my IT background, just wanting to analyse everything. So the first step is observation. Now, in order to work out if something corresponds to a real event in the real world, you have to first observe the real world. So it has to start with this. That's probably the most important bit. In the example of the rain, if someone says to us it's raining, the first step is to look out the window. It's obvious, right? Okay, second step is hypothesis. So what we might do is we might form some hypothesis, some ideas about what's going on. So, in the case of the rain, we might say, well, one possibility is that it's raining, assuming we can see drops falling. Another possibility is that someone might be watering their flowers in the flat above. So, once we've formed our hypotheses, we can move on to the next step, which is called evaluation. So in this step, we take each hypothesis in turn, and we use it to predict a set of hypothetical observations. And we compare those hypothetical observations with the real observations. And the hypothesis that forms the predicted observation that most closely matches the real observation, you'd say is the more true of the two. So this is what we do in the balance phase, where we weigh each up in turn, measuring that correlation. Once we've done that, we move on to qualified conclusion. So I've written the word qualified here because with this method, we must always accept that we can be wrong. If it turns out later that there's some more evidence comes to light, which we previously hadn't seen, or if someone comes up with a better hypothesis that fits the evidence better, then we have to change our mind and form a new opinion. Okay, so that covers the first model of truth. So I'm going to move on now to the second one, which is, you'll see, in some ways is the opposite. Okay. Second one is called constructivism. So the constructivist theory of truth tells us that something is true if some form of authority tells us it's true. Okay? So going back to the example of the rain, if someone tells us it's raining, then that's true if a person in authority tells us it's raining, and it's false otherwise. So, once, as before, I'm going to analyse this one and break it down into steps. So the first step is we call candidate conclusions. So the first thing to note is that in the world around us, there are many sources of authority. And these come from a variety of places, and some of them are quite obvious, some of them are quite subtle, and some of them are quite unexpected. And I'm going to come on to a couple of examples of those in a minute. But what we notice is that for most of us, our form of authority is the TV. And so to keep things simple for now, you can imagine these candidate conclusions as coming from different TV channels. So you've got your BBC, CNN, DR, and so on. But then you've also got sensationalist so-called alternative media, such as InfoWars and the like. And each of these are presenting narratives or conclusions. So how do we choose which one we're going to select? Okay, so the way we do this is by filtering out the unwanted sources of authority. And we call this authority filtering. So, for many people, the BBC might always win against InfoWars. But for other people, it might be quite as easily the other way around. So we build our authority filter by mimicking those of the people around us. We mimic our peers and our colleagues at work, that kind of thing. And this is why we tend to find cultures all around the world where the inhabitants follow the same narratives and obey the same authority and conform to the same behaviours. And this is one aspect of a subject called conformity, which Joe's going to tell us a lot more about in a minute. So I'll move on because I don't want to steal her thunder. Now, because we're focused on authority with this method of truth, we're focused on authority, we're focused on personalities. It can often lead us to the impression that the world is just one big personality cult. And we find that many people are focused not on what's being said, but on who's saying it. And they tend to be fixated by people's credentials, people's qualifications, people's job titles, and so on. Anyway, so moving on. Once we've selected our source of authority, we have our conclusion, so we move straight on to absolute conclusion. Now you notice I put the word absolute here this time, and for followers of this method of the truth, what they think is the absolute truth, because when truth comes from authority, we know that it's unvarying. And you see this a lot with people who are very insistent about their beliefs. Think of those two stick men again. And you get this entrenchment between people who follow these different beliefs or follow different authorities. Now, I think for many people, I think they actually prefer this because the absolute conclusion gives people a sense of certainty and security, whereas the qualified conclusion that we saw earlier, I think makes people feel uncomfortable that things could change underneath them. So I think that's why many people find this more attractive in many ways. Okay, so normally you'd think that was it, but as you can see there's a bit of slide spare at the bottom. So we get a hint that we're not quite done yet. So here comes the difficult bit, because somehow we have to relate this back to the world of observation. We somehow have to get back to the real world. Of course, we haven't made any observations yet. We've just listened to the guy on the telly. So we call this process canonical filtering, because the observations that match the narrative are selected, and those that don't match the narrative are rejected. And so they're filtered out. And what you're left with is the official canon of the narrative. You can see how we've got similarities here with a religious system or a belief system. So right at the end then, we get back to observations. And you notice that in this model, observations are last, whereas in the first one, observations were first.
Once we realised that for most of us, truth came from authority, and that the most prominent form of authority in all of our lives was the TV, we began to regard the TV as a possible source of a modern-day belief system. In exploring this further, we started to compare aspects of traditional religious belief to modern-day belief as shown from the TV. Here's another clip from our presentation that describes this in more detail.
One thing we noticed that happened a lot when people believe in authority, we found that they had a tendency to reject observation. And we see this tendency going on both in dogmatic traditional religion and in the belief system that stems from the TV. And I just want to go through now a couple of examples of this happening. The first example is from a traditional religion. I've chosen Christianity, but I could have chosen any religion, so I'm not having a go at Christians or anything. And then the examples after that come from the TV. So the first example is Moses and the Red Sea. So in this story, we're invited to believe the story that Moses somehow parted the Red Sea. Now, of course, in the real world, the correspondence world, we know that we can never observe anyone parting any sea. To do this would require an evenly distributed force acting on both walls of water. The force would have to be greater at the bottom than at the top and have to be varied continuously over the wall of water. And we've never seen anyone do this, and we cannot envisage any process by which this could be done. Now, in the constructivist world, of course, the constructive world invites us to throw aside our observations, or lack of them in this case, and enter into an unreal make-believe universe. Now, of course, in this example, people might point out that there are actually very few people who believe this story, and that's probably true, although I have met a couple. You do meet them now and again. So moving in swiftly on then, let's look at the next one. So the next example is from the TV. So the next example is the free fall of Building 7 on 9/11. So the TV tells us that the Building 7 collapsed with the free fall acceleration and at the same time was crushed to dust. Now, the TV also tells us that no other source of energy was present during the actual collapse. But back in the real world, we know that if all the potential energy of the tower was converted into kinetic energy, and that's what we mean when we say a free-fall collapse, then there can be no energy left in the system to pulverize the building. So then we're left with the question as to where did that extra energy come from? And we're not talking about a mere trifle here. If imagine yourself trying to break up the building with a sledgehammer, think how long it would take and how difficult it would be. It's a lot of energy. So, it can't just have appeared out of thin air. So once again, the constructivist world invites us to throw aside our observations and enter into an unreal make-believe universe. Now, it's not just that we've been told a lie in this case. It's much, much more serious than that. We've been invited into an unreal kind of fairyland where the impossible is somehow true. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about energy and conservation of energy. Now, at this point, some people might suggest that these laws themselves are simply just a product of truth by authority. For many of us, we've learnt these laws at school, and what is school other than a source of authority? Now, the big difference, of course, is that if you don't believe the laws of conservation of energy are true, you can simply conduct an experiment yourself to verify them. And I myself have done this at school, and I'm sure that many of you have as well. So when you conduct an experiment and verify these things yourself, the source of authority becomes yourself. So and this is the difference between correspondence truth and truth by authority. In authority, truth by authority, you're bowing to the authority of other people, whereas in this method, it's you who's doing the authorization, I guess you'd say. Now, let's move on then. So, 7/7. In the 7/72 bombings, we're told that hair bleach and black pepper was used by the so-called terrorists to construct their bomb. And so hair bleach was the oxidizing agent, hydrogen peroxide, and black pepper was supposed to be the reducing agent. Now, back in the real world, the world of correspondence, we know that it's impossible to make a bomb out of hair bleach and black pepper. Okay? Now, again, if you don't believe this, you can construct an experiment for yourself and become your own authority. You can go down the shop, buy the hair bleach, go down to Tesco's, buy the black pepper, Mix them together, do anything you want, heat them up. Perfectly safe. Anyone can do it without harming themselves. Let your kids do it, no problem. The worst thing that's going to happen is you're going to get a bleached cat that maybe was sneezing a bit, I don't know. So, once again, the constructivist world invites us to throw aside our observations and enter into a make-believe world. A world of mad guys with beards making military-grade explosives in their bathtubs with items purchased off their grocery list. Okay, so let's move on then. So, next example, chemtrails, or persistent ice. So the TV, of course, is largely silent about these. When it does comment, it tells us these are water droplets, water vapour, or ice crystals. But, once more, back in the real world, we know that water vapour, water droplets, and ice crystals cannot exist in any volume of air which is above the dew point. And we know the air is above the dew point because if it were below the dew point, there'd already be a cloud there. So, ice crystals don't stay there, persist, broaden into thick stripes, and then grow in volume, turn into opalescent white sheets which cover the whole sky. They just don't behave like that. And once again, if you don't believe me, simple, you can conduct your own experiment. Okay, now I admit, probably a bit more difficult in this case, but you could get a big glass tank, you could fill it with some air above the dew point, you could get an atomizer and spray in some ice crystals in a plume, and you could watch to see what happens. And what will happen is those ice crystals will dissolve or sublime into the air and become invisible. They wouldn't stay there in a big cloud. Now, of course, in this case, for many people, the act of rejection of the observation just consists in their refusal to look up at the sky. So for many people, their belief system is more powerful than their neck muscles.
When we started to investigate why it might be that, for many people, observation is rejected in favour of authority, we realised that psychology had a big part to play in all this. One central theme that kept cropping up over and over again was the idea of conformity, and it became apparent to us that conformity controls our lives more than we realise. There have been many experiments from history which have shown this, and probably one of the most important was done by a guy called Solomon Asch. Here's a short clip from his experiment to explain how this works.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the three lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the fifth person with the white t-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2, 2, 2,
2,
2, 3, 3, 3, 3.
But on the third trial, something happens.
2, 2,
2,
2,
2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
1.
Asch found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1.
1.
They must be right. There are 4 of them and 1 of me.
1.
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1. 1. 1. 2. 1. 2. 2. 2.
I know they're wrong, but why should I make waves?
2.
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2. 2. 2. 2.
In the previous experiment, the naive subject stood alone against the group. In this variation, Asch gave the naive subject a partner. here seated in the third position, who also gives the correct response.
1.
1.
2.
1.
2.
With a partner, yielding drops to only 5% of the critical trials compared to 37% without a partner. Although subjects report warmth and good feeling toward the partner, they typically deny that he played a role in their own independence. The partnership variation shows that much of the power of the group came not merely from its numbers, but from the unanimity of its opposition. When that unanimity is punctured, the group's power is greatly reduced. Sometimes we go along with a group because what they say convinces us they are right. This is called informational conformity. But sometimes we conform because we are apprehensive that the group will disapprove if we are deviant. This is called normative conformity. The strength of the normative factor is shown in another variation carried out by Ash. In this variation, the subject is told that because he had arrived late, he would have to write his answers. Subjects in this private response experiment are exposed to the same amount of misleading information as other subjects, but they are immune from any possible criticism by the group.
1.
1.
1.
And this enormously reduces the pressure to conform. Conformity drops by 2/3. Ash's experiment is a classic. It reveals how people will deny what they see and submit to group pressure. It allows us not only to observe conformity, but to study the conditions that increase or reduce its occurrence.
What this Solomon Asch experiment shows us is that our tendency to conform to the opinions of the group is very strong. Of course, the TV gives us the impression that the majority have already adopted the narrative that it presents, and this enhances our tendency to conform and reduces our ability to think critically. We hope you found the material we've presented here interesting. Needless to say, this is just a small sample of what's in our book. If you like what you've seen, you can follow us on Facebook, or you can download a free sample of our book from the website. I'll leave some links in the description box below so you can find things easily. Thanks very much for watching.